Welcome back. My name is Stephanie Austin, and in this session we'll talk about climate change adaptation options for sustainable infrastructure investments. So there are two complementary approaches to dealing with climate change. The first being climate change mitigation, which refers to reducing our greenhouse gas emissions or enhancing carbon sinks, and the second being climate change adaptation. So adaptation refers to taking action to prepare for and adjust to both the current effects of climate change and the predicted impacts in the future. So through adaptation, we can reduce climate risk by reducing biophysical hazards and threats, by reducing exposure, or by reducing vulnerability. So even with all the right mitigation and measures in place, as we agreed upon with the Paris Agreement, there's still going to be some level of climate change that we won't be able to stop anymore. We're already seeing the impacts of climate change, and you might have already noticed them in your own life or in your professional experience. So that's why adaptation needs to be a priority for all countries that are particularly vulnerable without losing sight of mitigation as well. We need to control greenhouse gas emissions at all costs to avoid even further changes in the climate. If we fail with mitigation, the adaptation efforts required will dramatically increase. So let's look at each of these one at a time. So first, we can try to reduce our climate change effects and biophysical hazards or threats. So this can be done, for example, through investments into low carbon development or through ecosystem service rehabilitation and adaptation to new climate conditions. We can also reduce our exposure. So this could be done, for example, by restricting or avoiding developments and settlements and infrastructure systems located at hazardous locations. Or it could be done, for example, by reducing existing exposure through resettlement or redirecting development. Another approach is to reduce our vulnerability. So this could be done, for example, by making investments into protection of infrastructure beyond identified and agreed thresholds. It could be done through investments into the physical and operational robustness of infrastructure assets and their single components. Or it can also be done through investments into residual risk management, such as an early warning and response systems, business continuity management that can entail creating redundant critical systems, relief, and recovery mechanisms. There are also more cross-cutting approaches to create enabling environments for adaptation, which include financing, policy, capacity building, providing climate information, and environmental protection. So let's look at a few examples of adaptation options for hydropower infrastructure. Let's say that we have a change in precipitation. So think about how can we reduce hazards from changes in precipitation? Well, one approach could be to increase upstream water retention capacity and slow infiltration through environmental measures to recharge aquifers and reduce surface flow runoff. And here we have a photo of a wetland in Egypt. Another option to adapt to changes in precipitation could be to try to reduce exposure. So this can be done, for example, by realigning roads and identifying and constructing alternative routes for roads. And here we have a photo from a road that's been washed out from flooding in Uganda in 2020. Another approach, again, is to reduce vulnerability. So that can be done, for example, by increasing physical protection. We could plant trees along the river. This is known as riparian planting to try to protect water infrastructure from damages. And here we have some photos of riparian planting in Rwanda. And what I really want to highlight here is that two of these measures, the reducing hazards measure and the reducing vulnerability measure, both include measures that relate to ecosystems and what's known as ecosystem-based adaptation, which we'll look at a little bit more in a moment. And it's really important to highlight ecosystems when we're talking about climate change adaptation because these are highly related. The links between ecosystems and climate change adaptation are twofold. First, ecosystems are vulnerable to climate change. Increasing temperatures, changing rainfall patterns, and increasing frequency of extreme events such as droughts and floods are some of the impacts that could affect the integrity and the functioning of ecosystems. Those managing or conserving ecosystems will have to adapt their strategies and management to protect those ecosystems. On the flip side, ecosystems actually deliver services that are vital for people worldwide. Those ecosystem services can contribute to reducing climate risk, a concept that's being referred to as ecosystem-based adaptation. So ecosystem-based adaptation is the use of biodiversity and ecosystem services as part of an overall adaptation strategy to help people to adapt to the adverse effects of climate change. So ecosystem-based adaptation, or EBA as it's also known, can be a really useful part of climate change adaptation and should be considered when you're preparing your adaptation measures and trying to climate-proof your infrastructure investments. So EBA can take many shapes and forms and are relevant for a variety of contexts and ecosystems. In the Nile Basin, the most relevant EBA options for climate-proofing water infrastructure are those that minimize the impacts of increased sedimentation due to erosion, flood damages, evaporation, and concentration of pollutants, since these stressors pose the greatest risk to water infrastructure and the services that they provide. There are a number of examples of EBA options for water infrastructure on the slide, so I encourage you to pause and take a read through. But in the context of infrastructure, EBA measures can be thought of as on a continuum of green to gray. So it's not just whether we have gray infrastructure or entirely green EBA measures, but there are often a lot of hybrid approaches that are available. So all of these aspects of EBA will be discussed more in the next session. Thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to seeing you in our next session together.